A 74-year-old widow got a letter in the mail one Tuesday morning. It told her she owed $10,000, or she could lose her house. She hadn't robbed anyone. She hadn't broken any laws. Her fence was 6 inches too tall. This is what happened next. Eleanor had lived on the same street for 31 years. She moved into her house on Sycamore Drive, back when the neighbourhood was brand new, just poured concrete driveways, freshly planted trees that were still thin as broomsticks, and neighbours introducing themselves across unfenced yards. She and her husband, Frank, raised their 2 daughters there. They painted every room together. They planted a rose garden along the back fence. When Frank got sick, the neighbours brought meals for 3 weeks straight. When he passed, Eleanor stayed. Of course she stayed. This was home. The neighbourhood had an HOA, a homeowners association, that had been running since the beginning. For most of those 31 years, it was basically invisible. It kept the entrance looking nice, sent out reminders before the holidays, handled a noise complaint here and there. Most people forgot it existed until their annual dues bill showed up, but a few years back, something changed. 3 board members who had been elected quietly, most residents didn't even remember voting, stopped rotating off like they were supposed to. They started treating the HOA like their own private business, and they started running it like one too. Eleanor was 74 years old, retired, and living on a fixed income from Social Security and a small pension Frank had left behind. She was not the kind of person who made trouble. She went to church on Sundays. She baked lemon cake for new neighbours. She knew the name of every dog on her street. 4 doors down lived Ray, retired electrician, mid-50s, a man who genuinely, sincerely just wanted to be left alone. He had a small vegetable garden in the back, a comfortable chair on the front porch, and absolutely no interest in neighbourhood drama. His motto, as his wife liked to joke, was, "Not my circus, not my monkeys." Ray and Eleanor weren't close friends exactly. They were the kind of neighbours who waved every morning. The kind who would pick up a package off the other's porch without being asked. The kind of quiet, dependable connection that holds a neighbourhood together without anyone noticing it's there. Neither of them had any idea that within a few months, one of them would be fighting to save her house, and the other would accidentally become the person who organised an entire community to help her do it. But that's how these things go. Nobody signs up to be a hero. They just look out their window one day, see something wrong, and decide they can't pretend they didn't see it. The board was led by a man named Gerald. Gerald had been on the Sycamore Drive HOA board for 6 years, originally elected for a 2-year term, but somehow still there. He had a way of running meetings that made residents feel like they were interrupting him, even when he'd called the meeting himself. It started with small things. A fine for a trash bin left at the curb an hour past pickup, a warning letter for a garden ornament someone had owned for 12 years without complaint, a citation for a car parked in a resident's own driveway because it was a work truck, and work trucks were commercial vehicles under an obscure clause nobody had ever enforced before. People grumbled. But people always grumble about HOA stuff. Most folks figured it wasn't worth the fight. Then residents started comparing notes, quietly at first, mostly in the Nextdoor app, and a pattern became impossible to ignore. Certain houses never got fined. Specifically, the houses belonging to people who were friendly with Gerald and the other 2 board members. One board member's adult son had a construction van parked in his driveway 6 nights a week. Not a word was said. Meanwhile, the Delgado family, who'd moved in just 3 months earlier, got a violation notice for leaving moving boxes on the curb for 2 extra days. 2 days. They still hadn't finished unpacking, and then came the news that made everyone's stomach drop. The HOA Reserve Fund, money collected from monthly dues, meant to cover road repairs, landscaping and community maintenance, was short. Not a little short. Tens of thousands of dollars short. When a resident named Carol asked about it at a board meeting, Gerald said it was under review and moved to the next item on the agenda. When Carol pressed him, Gerald cut her microphone, just turned it off. In a public meeting, with her still standing there, a video of that moment was posted to Nextdoor the next morning. Within 24 hours, it had been seen by nearly every household in the neighbourhood. People were furious, but they were still furious individually. They hadn't yet figured out how to be furious together. That part came later, and Eleanor was the reason it did. About 2 years before all of this, Eleanor had received a letter from the HOA about her backyard fence. It had been built years earlier, with help from Frank's brother, and it stood about 6 inches higher than what the covenants technically allowed. The letter asked her to bring it into compliance. Eleanor wrote back, a polite, handwritten letter, explaining that she was on a fixed income and that replacing the fence would cost somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 she simply didn't have. She asked if the board might grant her a variance, or at least give her a payment plan and a timeline. She never got a response. She assumed the matter had been dropped. It hadn't. On a Tuesday morning in March, Eleanor opened her mailbox and found a certified letter from the HOA. The fence, it said, had been in violation for 24 consecutive months. Late fees had been compounding at a rate she had never been told about, in correspondence she had never received. Her total balance due was $9,840, and if the balance was not paid within 60 days, the HOA had the right to place a lien on her property. Eleanor sat down on her porch steps and stayed there for a long time. Her neighbour across the street, a woman named Diane, saw her through the window and came over. Eleanor showed her the letter without saying a word. Diane took a photo of it. She asked Eleanor if that was okay. Eleanor said yes. That photo went on Nextdoor that evening with one sentence. "This is what they sent our neighbour Eleanor. She's 74. She's lived here for 31 years. We need to talk about this." By midnight, there were over 200 comments. By the following morning, Ray had read every single one of them. He sat with his coffee, and he read the anger and the fear and the stories people were finally sharing out loud, and something shifted in him that he later said he couldn't fully explain. He typed a message and posted it before he could talk himself out of it. "I'm not an organiser and I'm not a lawyer. But I have a garage and a Saturday. If you want to actually do something about this, not just post about it, come over." 10 in the morning, Ray expected maybe 15 people. Possibly 20 if he was lucky. 52 showed up. His garage fit about 12 comfortably. People stood in the driveway, on the lawn, leaning against cars. Someone brought a folding table. Someone else brought a whiteboard they'd pulled out of their home office. It became, without anyone planning it, something between a community meeting and a war council. The first thing they did was stop venting and start documenting. Ray handed out pieces of paper and asked everyone to write down every interaction they'd had with the board in the past 3 years. Every letter. Every fine. Every ignored phone call. Every meeting where someone's question got brushed aside. They wrote for almost 20 minutes, and when people started reading what they'd written out loud, the room kept going quieter and quieter, not because people were calming down, but because they were realising just how big this actually was. Then a woman in the back spoke up. Her name was Patricia. She was a family law attorney, not an HOA specialist, but she'd spent the previous week reading their state's HOA statutes and their own community's governing documents, which she'd had to formally request from the board 3 times before finally receiving them. What she laid out was careful and measured, because she knew how important it was to be right. She said that based on her reading, several of the fines issued, including Eleanor's, appeared to have procedural problems. That fine notices were supposed to follow a specific process, including written warnings before penalties could escalate. That board meetings had legal notice requirements. That amending community bylaws without a proper homeowner vote could be challenged. She was careful not to overpromise. She said these were things worth looking into, and potentially worth fighting. She said she didn't know what the outcome would be, but she knew that doing nothing was a guaranteed outcome. Someone near the front said, "So what do we actually do?" Patricia outlined 3 steps. 1. File a formal complaint with the state's HOA regulatory office. Yes, that existed. 2. Consult with an HOA attorney, even just for an initial paid consultation, to evaluate Eleanor's specific case. 3. Look into whether the community had legal grounds for a recall election to remove the board. It took 3 weeks, not 5 days, not a weekend. 3 weeks of door-to-door conversations, of people scanning and sharing documents, of a group text chain that grew to over 80 members. It wasn't clean or fast or cinematic. It was tedious. But it worked. 73% of homeowners signed the recall petition, well above the threshold required. When the petition was formally submitted, Gerald sent a letter calling it procedurally flawed and motivated by bad faith. He did not specify which procedures. He did not address Eleanor's situation. He did not explain the missing reserve funds. Patricia added his letter to the file, and the file kept growing. The special recall meeting happened on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after that first gathering in Ray's garage. The community room at the local library was booked to capacity. People arrived 40 minutes early. Residents who couldn't get seats stood in the hallway outside with the door propped open. Gerald and the 2 other board members sat at a folding table at the front of the room. They had brought an attorney with them. The attorney had a briefcase and a very steady expression and said nothing for the first 45 minutes. One by one, residents walked to the microphone. They did not yell. They did not accuse. They read dates. They read fine amounts. They read the language from letters they had received. One man, a retired accountant named Dennis, presented a 3-page summary of the reserve fund discrepancies he had reconstructed from the financial records. The board had been legally required to provide records that had taken a separate formal request to obtain. Dennis did not say anyone stole anything. He said the numbers did not add up and that he would be grateful if someone could explain them. No one did. Eleanor spoke near the end. She had written a few notes on an index card, but she barely looked at it. She said she wasn't there because she was angry. She said she was there because she had lived in this community for 31 years, and she wanted to keep living here, and she didn't understand why that had become a fight. She thanked her neighbours for showing up. She sat back down. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone did. Gerald's attorney raised 2 procedural objections to the recall vote. Both were answered, calmly, specifically, by statute number, by Patricia, who was standing near the side wall with a notepad. The vote was held. All 3 board members were removed. Gerald packed up his papers and left without speaking. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale, and it's worth being honest about that. The new board, 5 residents elected in the weeks after the recall, had to spend months cleaning up the mess that had been left behind, sorting through contradictory records, figuring out what the reserve fund had actually been spent on, rebuilding a system of documentation that should have existed all along. Eleanor's case took time too. The HOA's attorney and Patricia went back and forth for several weeks. In the end, a significant portion of Eleanor's fine was reduced, the escalating late fees were removed, and she was granted the variance she had asked for in writing 2 years earlier. It wasn't a zero balance. It wasn't perfectly resolved. But she was not going to lose her house. She sent Ray a lemon cake. He said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. The financial discrepancies were referred to the county. As of the time this story was compiled, that process was still ongoing. These things take time. They don't always end in dramatic courtroom moments. Sometimes they just end in paperwork and quiet accountability. The neighbourhood was not magically united. Some people who had supported Gerald felt embarrassed or defensive. Some long-time tensions between neighbours didn't disappear. Real life doesn't work that cleanly. But something did change. People started showing up to HOA meetings who had never shown up before. The new board posted meeting minutes online within a week of every session. When the first fine notice went out under new leadership, it included a formal written warning letter 30 days prior, exactly as the process was supposed to work. Small things, but the right things. Here is what I want you to take away from this. HOA boards have genuine power over your home. Most homeowners never read the documents that define the limits of that power. The people in this story did, and it made all the difference. Know what you signed. Know what they're allowed to do. And know that you're not alone. See you in the next one.